This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Our brain is an amazing organ, and for years, scientists have searched for the cell responsible for our ability to remember faces. It was called the so-called grandmother neuron. Now scientists have published new research in the journal Science about a discovery of cells that link face perception to long-term memory. Today we talk about this discovery and how it could impact future interventions for diseases related to memory like Alzheimer's or another condition you may not have heard of called prosopagnosia or face blindness. Coming up, we talk with a Connecticut woman with this condition. You can join us too. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. My first guest on Zoom is Winrich Freiwald, head of the Laboratory of Neural Systems at the Rockefeller University in New York City. He and his team are credited for the discovery of the grandmother neurons. Winrich, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, I understand that this concept of the grandmother neuron came up in an MIT classroom a long time ago, and now you and your fellow researchers have discovered the grandmother neurons. So talk a little bit about this concept and how you got to this point, Winrich.
Yes, so the concept originated in 1969, as you said, when an MIT professor, Jerry Letwin, talked to his class and made up a story about this Russian neurosurgeon who had a patient obsessed with his mother and to ask the neurosurgeon to heal him from this obsession. The neurosurgeon, being true to his trade, would perform a surgery and remove the 18,000 cells in this patient's brain that were responsible for him knowing anything about his mother at all. And the surgery was successful. The patient, however, could not know anything about his mother anymore, could not recognize her, but was healed of his obsession. This was, of course, a complete invention, nothing like this had ever done. But it was the origin of this idea that in your brain, with its billions and billions of nerve cells called neurons that are connected to each other to form this incredibly complicated web, that somewhere inside this brain, you would have cells that would be specifically responsible for your ability to recognize someone that you're personally familiar with or a loved one like your grandmother. And so it lived on for 50 years and more as a proposal that's something that should exist. But something that has never been found. And so this is why it was so exciting for us to discover cells that share many of these properties. It's kind of the greatest thing in science if something is predicted to exist for such a long time and no one has seen it. But we also discovered that the properties of these cells are actually quite different from what Jerry Letwin and others imagined in their day. And that was exciting. And then the finding was just very clear and very beautiful. And so all of these things together make us really excited about this discovery.
Now, I understand in your research, a group of neurons in the brains of rhesus monkeys lit up when you showed them photos of their monkey friends. So walk us through when we see a familiar face. What's happening in that part of the brain, Winrich?
Yes. So what happens is you have this very small region in your brain, in a part actually that has not been much researched, that we know very little about. But really only in this one small region you find cells that will be specifically activated, not just when you see a face in general, or when you're able to tell the difference between two faces, but very specifically when you see the faces of your loved ones or of people that you've met before and that you're very familiar with. So these cells combine two properties that are fundamentally different. One is a perceptual property, that is that the cell is responding to an image, in this case, an image of a face. And the memory component is that the cells only respond to images of people that you have encountered personally before. And this personal encounter is really very important here. We show these pictures thousands and thousands of times. And this is not what the cells want. What the cells want to respond is the picture of someone you encountered in real life that you're highly familiar with, like your grandmother.
What does this mean in this last year of the pandemic, Winrich, when so many of us have been interacting via screens when it comes to feeling familiar with somebody, as you mentioned?
Yes, so I would think that many of you had the experience like I had, that you can generate a sense of familiarity with someone that you meet on Zoom, even within a few minutes. And it probably has to do with the fact that it's not just pictures that you're seeing, but it's a live video. That it has to do with the fact that it's not just, images coming in, but also the voice can be heard. And with the fact that there's a consequential interaction. What you're saying now influences what I'm saying. And so you realize that I'm responding to what you are saying. And so there is a sense of live interaction, even if we're physically, hundreds of miles apart from each other.
When you were researching with the monkeys, when they saw a picture versus someone or their monkey friends they saw in person, there was a difference in how their brain reacted, Winrich?
Yes, it's completely different. And this is what was so surprising for us. We have worked on face recognition for 20 years now, and all the face areas we have studied and we discovered, they do not really care whether there's a picture of someone you know or someone you don't know. It's all about the physical properties of the face. How big the eyes are, if the forehead is big, things like that. That's what the cells and all other face areas care for. But this one extra area cares for that also. But in addition, it is essential that you have this personal familiarity. So that's why we think that when you are recognizing loved one, when you know that now grandmother is there, that this area is supporting that process.
You're hearing on Zoom with me Winrich Freiwald, head of the Laboratory of Neural Systems at the Rockefeller University in New York City. He and his team are credited for the discovery of the grandmother neurons, which connects to our vision or recognition with long-term memory. And so the fact that you've discovered this must be very exciting, but talk about the long-term implications of this when we think about conditions that are related to memory and memory loss.
Yes, we are at the Rockefeller University, and at the Rockefeller University, we have this beautiful motto, science for the benefit of humanity. And this is basic research, but when we do basic research, we always have an eye on applications of how we can use this research to better the conditions of people who are suffering from sometimes debilitating conditions. Your ability to recognize people that you know, recognizing your loved ones, is really of the core of what makes you human. And so if there's an impairment of that, that is the most devastating experience that anyone can have. An Alzheimer's patient who's not able to recognize her loved ones anymore, and then the loved ones recognizing that they are not recognized anymore. This is dissolving the social fabric. And so whenever we make a discovery like this into something that's fundamentally human, we always think of applications. And we're actually even thinking right now to start a center on the social brain to facilitate the discoveries like this one on our social nature and also applications. So what we're hoping for concretely is that we can devise strategies based on this knowledge specifically that we now have gained to help people with face blindness, to help people with autism spectrum disorder, or people with Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative disorders to preserve and maybe improve their ability to specifically recognize the loved ones.
That's really fascinating. So this region where the grandmother neurons are is also the part of the brain that's most affected by these conditions you just mentioned, Winrich?
That's right. In particular, Alzheimer's and neurodegenerative disorders. So it's one of the first to be affected. And so therefore, we have to make a great effort to try and preserve these functions. It's devastating enough if you have other difficulties memorizing or knowing where you are, but this disconnection from the social world is really the most horrible thing imaginable.
How has the scientific community responded to this discovery, Winrich?
Oh, with a lot of excitement. So I got a lot of emails and a lot of colleagues were writing to me because this has been something that's been there for like 50 years and more, and but something that has not been seen. And at the same time, it's reflecting new knowledge. We did not find exactly what Jerry Letwin was imagining, but we found new properties that are, very nice and very beautiful and make a lot of sense to us today. So it's a bit of like a relief in the community. We got it. And now we can really understand how this is working and how we can, what happens in our brains when we recognize someone that we know.
Because of this discovery, can you talk more about, are there particular therapies for patients who have this part of their brain impaired that could help stimulate them, whether it's a particular video game or an app?
Exactly. So we're thinking along those lines to devise behavioral strategies, especially fun ones, that give you a lot of interaction while you are engaged in this kind of treatment. We're also thinking about therapies that involve biofeedback, where we would be imaging the brain of a person engaged in this video game, and then use that activation in the brain to modify what is on the screen for this person. And so tapping directly into the activity of this one brain area that we discovered would possibly greatly improve the effects we can get with this behavioral training.
Earlier I talked about how our brain is an amazing organ. We're talking about these grandmother neurons, but I understand that there are neuroscientists who've discovered the Jennifer Aniston neuron. There's the concept of the Darth Vader neuron. Can you talk about what's going on in our brains?
Yes. So this is a discovery a friend of mine, Rodrigo Quiroga, made several years ago in a very different part of the brain. And that discovery has been dominating our way of thinking about how the perception of a face might be linked to long-term memory. And now our finding kind of turns us on the head and then is pointing in a completely different direction. The Jennifer Aniston neuron is a neuron that he found that would respond also to pictures of Jennifer Aniston's face, but it would also respond to her voice or maybe just the name written out. And so it is not a visual neuron. It is not rapidly responding. It's not reliably responding to an incoming face stimulus, but it's more related to the concept of this particular person. There's also a Sydney Opera House neuron. So the thinking was that there are neurons that are intermingled in a large region of the brain and that you might discover in one subject, but never again, because they're very difficult to find, and that they would represent concepts of the world that we have formed over time. So they're more related to our knowledge and our cognition. What we have found is perceptual. It's very fast. It's very reliable. It happens every time you're seeing a particular stimulus. And also, these neurons are not distributed. They are concentrated in one part of the brain. And so one of the really beautiful things about this is that what your brain is doing when you are familiarizing yourself with a new person, when you're getting to know someone, it is somehow accessing this one little region and updating it to form this new memory of this one person's face in that particular region. And so this is exciting for us as scientists because that really makes it possible for us to understand how that's happening and how you're learning knowledge about new people.
So we've been talking about, again, as you mentioned, when we recognize someone, but also how it ties back to our long-term memory. But how does bias enter into this whole process, Winrich?
So, this is something that we don't really understand very well. There are biases in that you're more easily able to recognize some people, but not others. Like one particular implication is in the courtroom. Is a lot of very consequential decisions in the courtroom are made based on eyewitness testimony. And we now know from exoneration cases where DNA evidence proved without doubt, that wrongful convictions occurred, that in 70% of the cases, there was an eyewitness misidentification happening. And so a lot of these times it can happen because of not a conscious bias, but an inherent bias and inherent ability to recognize some faces better than others.
That's really fascinating. Winrich Freiwald, thank you so much for joining us today here on Where We Live to talk about this discovery by you and your team at the Rockefeller University in New York City, the so-called grandmother neurons, more than one. What's next for you, Winrich, with this discovery?
We'd love to know how this area does what it's doing. We discovered what it is doing. We don't know yet how it is doing what it's doing. What I mean by that is that we had anticipated that this area would build on all the very complex computations and entire network of face areas which we have studied for some 20 years now. But the area is responding so fast that it must have a completely different set of inputs that we don't know yet about. We want to use it, as we discussed, to improve conditions like face blindness and Alzheimer's and autism spectrum disorders, and look into these applications and really understand how this one region supports recognition. What I should emphasize is when you recognize a person, it's a conscious experience. It's an aha moment, this eureka moment, where now you know that you recognize this person, and often it's a happy moment. So it has an emotional quality to it. So what we think is happening is that this one very small area is igniting activity in a large network of areas. And we would love to know how this network is working, how we then become conscious of the fact that we now recognize grandmother.
Well, we'd love to have you back as you and your team continue to research.
Thank you.
Winrich, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. After the break, we've learned about grandmother neurons and how they help our brains connect perception with memory. But how will this discovery help with future interventions and potential treatments of certain conditions like face blindness? We learn more about that coming up, and take your questions too. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. How good are you at recognizing faces? Some people have a condition called face blindness or prosopagnosia that makes it very difficult to recognize faces or to learn new faces. And those with severe cases even have trouble recognizing their loved ones. For more, joining us on Zoom is Brad Duchaine, professor at Dartmouth, chair of the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences, and co-founder of faceblind.org. Brad, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Lucy.
I used to always tease my husband because he's not good at recognizing faces. I'm much better, but now I think I'm beginning to understand why that is. Do we all have kind of a spectrum of how well we are at recognizing faces, Brad?
Yeah, that's right. So you've got there's a broad range of abilities when it comes to face recognition. So we've mentioned prosopagnosics here earlier in the show. Those are people who have a great deal of difficulty recognizing faces. Then there are people at the other end of the spectrum that are called super recognizers, who are fantastic when it comes to face recognition. And then there's most of us somewhere in the middle there. Some people are, above average. Some people are a little below average.
Now, I mentioned you're co-founder of faceblind.org. Our listeners can go to that website and take a test, I believe. I think that's what I did the other day, and I scored an 8 out of 10. So am I one of these super recognizers, Brad?
8 out of 10 is not going to do it, Lucy. That's
man.
Good,
Oh, my hopes are dashed, and my husband's going to laugh at me now. But tell us more when we think about people who have face blindness. How common is this?
It's going to depend on where you draw the line as to what counts as face blindness. But what we find is that if you just ask people about face recognition in daily life, that maybe the number might be as high as 1 out of 50 people have face recognition difficulties that regularly affect their daily life. They fail to recognize a neighbor who they actually know pretty well when they run into them at the grocery store, or, they don't recognize a coworker. So it's fairly common. So something like 2% of the population.
Wow. Well, someone is with us now on Zoom who has a form of prosopagnosia. A.E. Gaupp is a startup attorney based in Hartford. A.E., welcome to our show.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me.
So when did you discover that you had a form of face blindness? Can you talk about what it's been like for you?
Sure. I did not realize that I had something that had a name until much later in life, well into my 30s. But I realized once I kind of got more information that the first time that I was sort of smacked in the face with the daily sort of symptoms of it was when I went off to a large university for undergrad and was repeatedly having the experience of having someone walk up to me, call me by my name, continue a conversation. It's very clear that we had met and talked, and my brain was telling me I had never laid eyes on this person in my life. At the time, I just got really good at calling people by nondescript, like, hey, girl, or what's up, dude? Sort of friendly terms that didn't reveal. And I think I started building my coping skills and got used to just sort of picking up conversations that I didn't realize I was sort of continuing. At the time, though, I really think I chalked it up to the volume of socializing, the large number of people that I was sort of coming into contact with on a daily basis. But it was also the first time that I started hearing kind of feedback from my community that I had hurt somebody's feelings, or that somebody thought I was aloof or snobbish because I wasn't acknowledging them if we would sort of cross paths. And for me, the experience, of course, is that absolutely nothing pings in my brain when I'm seeing these people. The point in my life when I finally realized I had something was really amiss, I actually moved from Los Angeles, California, where I had been living for over a decade, to Prince Edward Island, Canada, which is a tiny community. And right almost from the start, it became clear that I was essentially snubbing all sorts of people that I had interacted with because I was unable to recognize them. And I was especially unable to recognize them out of context. So perhaps I knew them because they were a neighbor, or perhaps we attended the same church, or they were another parent at my children's preschool. If I saw them, though, at the grocery store or at the post office or in anything out of context, I simply would have no awareness that I was seeing somebody that I had met and that I should recognize. Mm. And then, of course, there's also a significant winter in Prince Edward Island. So once everyone bundled up with a scarf or even a face mask and a hat pulled over their hair, I lost all of the sort of attendant clues that I really rely on to recognize people, like hairstyle or glasses, even perhaps a piece of jewelry that they consistently wear, just sort of an overall style in their dress. Mm. All of those were sort of taken away from me. And it was very difficult to navigate because all of a sudden I was keenly aware I don't know who is around me at any given time.
What kind of toll did that take on you, AE, and when did you reach out for help?
Well, I'm someone who really tries to live my life in a way that is the least harmful to literally everyone around me. I sort of take to heart that responsibility to do no harm. And so I am certainly not someone who's looking to hurt anybody's feelings. And so that piece of it was really difficult, right? So these were people who I would love to recognize. And that concept that when you do in fact recognize someone, it's lighting up all sorts of like pleasant sensations in your brain. I recognize that because when I do actually recognize someone, I'm delighted that I have recognized them. It's almost like they sort of glow and stand out. And I really try to deeply attune to people when I meet them. And so there was a whole process of first sort of being critical of my own sense, right? Am I not tuning in? Am I not paying close enough attention? That sort of desire to sort of figure out a way to sharpen that, thinking that it was something I was doing wrong, I think led me to, researching online and finding faceblind.org, which Professor Duchaine is the co-founder of. Getting information, finding out that they're studying this, and wanting to help participate in that.
Brad Duchaine again is with us, professor at Dartmouth, as AE mentioned, co-founder of faceblind.org. Something AE had said early on was that she had a way of coping or tools to help recognize people when she noted that she was having trouble recognizing faces. And so is that common that people just chalk it up as, well, this is the way I am, and they don't know that they have this particular condition, Brad?
Yeah, that's very common. So we tend to assume that our cognitive or our perceptual abilities are similar to everybody else's. And so I hear stories from prosopagnosics who say, before I found out about prosopagnosia, I would watch movies in which there would be a lineup because there'd been a crime committed, and the character in the movie would pick out the person who had committed the crime. And I thought, come on, that's absurd. Nobody could do that sort of thing. And so that's very normal that AE felt that everybody else was just like her, and so what we tend to hear is that a lot of people with prosopagnosia will rely on particular non-face parts of people to recognize them. So the hair, like AE mentioned, or they'll recognize the voice when they encounter somebody, but those ways of recognizing people just aren't as effective as the face is, and so they're going to struggle when they use those other cues to person recognition.
We're learning about face blindness today. If you have a question, you can join us. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. With the community of people that have reached out to you and your colleagues, Brad, at faceblind.org, do you find that some people are experiencing anxiety or depression because they're getting these reactions from people like, why don't you remember me? And they feel like they're alienating people even though they don't mean to.
Yeah, absolutely. People take it very personally when we don't recognize them. People consider that it's a sign that they're not important enough to us for us to recognize them. And so, if you fail to recognize, somebody you've even met just a few times, they don't like it. Then imagine, failing to recognize your boss in the elevator. It's going to cause you real problems.
Right. A. Gaupp, I wanted to go back to you. Again, this is a woman based in West Hartford. She's a startup attorney who has prosopagnosia or face blindness. Can I ask what it was like for you when you were dating, if you, again, have trouble recognizing people who are not super close to you?
Sure. It's so funny because it's really not something I thought much about, although I do think it's interesting if you sort of lined up everyone I've ever dated, it would make no sense. I certainly don't have a type when it comes to looks, because that is just not significant to me. When I meet someone, I tune in very carefully to sort of almost extrasensory feelings that I'm getting from them, sort of like their level of receptivity, their openness, whether there's a sense of tension about them or whether they're calm and content. I tend to respond significantly to that. So especially, I would say in dating relationships, how this person makes me feel. And when it comes to recognition, I will say it can be a little dicey early on. I will look at photographs of someone repeatedly, almost trying to learn to recognize them in between having an opportunity to spend time with them in person. I definitely in early dating have had that pang of anxiety, like walking into a restaurant, say if I need to go meet someone, having that feeling of, I hope I recognize them, right? As opposed to, it's easier if they pick you up, then you know it's the right person.
Well, thank you for sharing that part of your story, AE, with us. Again, you can join us, find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Brad Duchaine, I'm not sure if I asked you this question, I don't remember, but when we talk about this particular condition, and you said 1 in 50 may have some form of face blindness, is it something that people are born with, developmental, or is it something that's acquired, like a brain injury?
Well, you can both be born with it, or you can acquire it due to brain injury. And we were aware of the type of prosopagnosia that people acquired through brain injury for many years. And that's because it's fairly easy to see. Somebody's got normal face recognition, then let's say they have a stroke, and then they can no longer recognize people. It's like night and day. On the other hand, when people develop the condition, they've got nothing to compare normal. They can't compare their poor face recognition to previously normal face recognition. And as a result of the difficulty of noticing it, it took us a long time to even recognize that what we call developmental prosopagnosia was a condition. It really wasn't until the late 90s that it became obvious to a number of researchers that there are a lot of people out there who have never suffered any brain damage and yet have a really tough time recognizing people. It was the internet that helped us realize how many people were out there. In fact, it was a group of prosopagnosics who first created an online group where they were talking about their difficulties, and only after that did researchers get in touch with some of them.
Oh, that's really interesting. We have a caller, Zach, in Norwich, with a question. Zach, go ahead.
Hi, yeah, thanks for taking my call. So my question was for AE or, anybody that has input on this. I was just kind of wondering, if every time, you see somebody and you have, prosopagnosia, if you are kind of rediscovering their face, if you're, you meet somebody and again, you haven't picked up on any of the cues yet, and you're kind of rediscovering that. And again, that applies to like, if I wake up every morning and I'm next to my wife, who I think is beautiful, and I see her every day, am I rediscovering this beautiful person next to me? Am I like kind of relearning their face every day? Or is it, something that, it's just more of like a Picasso painting, like you can't really, make heads or tails of it.
Good question, Zach. AE, did you want to respond to that? What do you see when you look at someone?
It's so hard to know what I see because again, it's so hard to know how to describe an inner experience that is not shared, right? I do think Zach's on to something, though. There is a sense of presence that I'm almost forced into. And I will say I am often surprised, even when I see someone I recognize, by how they look, right? So there's that sense of, there is a bit of that, oh yeah, this person has like very sparkly eyes, or the way that their face lights up and looks like sunshine when they smile. Like that is very common. I know when I look at my children on a daily basis, there is that sense both of recognition and of surprise. Like, oh my gosh, they're so beautiful, right? So, gosh, if that's unique to those of us with face blindness, that feels like a blessing.
Brad Duchaine, did you want to add to that?
Well, I just wanted to elaborate a little on what AE said about sort of what she experiences when she sees a face. And of course, I can't get inside of AE's head to know what it is that she's seeing, but we've got some data that suggests that when people with prosopagnosia see an upright face, it's kind of similar to the experience that people with normal face recognition have when they look at an upside down face. And I say that because if we run perceptual tests, we'll find that the people with normal face recognition score about the same with those upside down faces as prosopagnosics do with upright faces. And when you look at an upside down face, you can tell it's a face, you can see the features, but you just can't sort of put it together in the same way that you can if it's upright. And so if I were to show you, say, famous faces and they were upside down, you might be able to work out who it is by looking at it for, say, 5 to 10 seconds. But it's not going to be that instantaneous recognition that you experience when you see the face upright.
AE, Brad had mentioned earlier, some people with face blindness, it can cause them real problems if they're in the elevator and they don't recognize that their boss is standing next to them. What has it been like for you working, and especially in this pandemic when, for a long time, none of us were seeing people in person?
I have had a handful of experiences that have been particularly poignant in the workforce. One, when I was sort of much younger, working at a law firm, and I mistook someone who is actually very, very dear to me for someone else in an elevator, that exact experience. And it's just crushing. You want to disappear, which in an elevator is truly not possible. And then much more recently, early on in a job, a position that I was sort of new to a few years ago, absolutely mistook the CEO of our public company because he had a set of distinctive glasses. And when I met him, that was what I took in. And the day that I had a chat with him, not knowing who I was speaking with, he wasn't wearing his glasses. And you have those moments where someone later is like, what did he say? And I'm like, what do you mean? They're like, well, what did the CEO say? I'm like, that was the CEO. Good thing, you develop those coping skills to sort of try to always remain polite and pleasant. I think more recently, I have joined a workforce that's entirely remote. So it's sort of embraced this brand new way of working. And it's an absolute relief to me because all of our interactions as a remote workforce are very intentional and deliberate. So again, kind of like the date coming to the door, and sort of knowing like the person who rings the bell is going to be the person I'm intending to meet. The person I've set up my Google Meet with or my Zoom with is going to be this person, right? I'm not going to be surprised. I get to spend a lot of time just focusing in on learning the details of this person. I tend, when I meet someone, to elicit a lot of, I suppose, unique details about their life, because that's one of the main things that I'm using to remember somebody by, right? So I will find out unique details about them, and that I can always remember, even if I can't remember the face. I am a huge fan of working remotely for this reason. The sort of the mental load and the anxiety, that sort of baseline level of anxiety, I can set aside. And that, clears up a lot more space to really think about the work.
Before we run out of time, Brad Duchaine, I wanted to go back to you, professor at Dartmouth, co-founder of faceblind.org. Earlier, we were learning about this discovery of the grandmother neurons. How do you think this discovery could help researchers better understand prosopagnosia or face blindness?
There's a couple things it does. So face recognition depends on sort of the coordinated activity of a number of different brain areas. And so what that suggests is that there are going to be a number of different types of prosopagnosia that occur. So if you've got sort of a malfunction in one of these areas, it's going to cause one type of prosopagnosia. A malfunction in another is going to cause a different type. The identification of this area that's engaged only by familiar faces tells us, well, here's another type of prosopagnosia that's going to exist. These people should have the normal ability to recognize unfamiliar faces. But when it comes to familiar faces, that's where they're going to struggle relative to other people. And so that tells us about this other type. What it also suggests is that when we're developing interventions to try to improve face recognition in prosopagnosia or autism or whatever condition you're focused on, is that we should be using familiar faces to try to engage these processes that Winrich's team identified. Because if we only use unfamiliar faces, and that's the way nearly all of the interventions that have been developed so far work, we're not engaging the entire system.
Brad Duchaine, again, is professor at Dartmouth and chair of the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences, co-founder of faceblind.org. Brad, I understand you've got upcoming research to recruit people with face blindness from Connecticut and other parts of New England. If our listeners go to faceblind.org, can they learn more there?
Yeah, they can. We would love to hear from people who think that they might have difficulties with face recognition, because we're gearing up right now for a large-scale study, and we're going to be recruiting from people from throughout New England and maybe even further afield. So we would love to hear from interested participants.
Well, thank you, Brad, for your time.
Thank you.
Also, A.E. Gaupp, a startup attorney in West Hartford who has face blindness. Thank you so much for sharing part of your story. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. And I hope if folks are listening and this sounds like someone they know, they're able to extend a little grace to that person.
Yes, a good reminder. Thank you. Coming up, our ability to recognize familiar faces starts at a very young age. We'll talk to a pediatrician about how babies' brains develop. You can join us too. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We've been learning about the cells in our brains that connect vision with long-term memory. It got us thinking about how babies' brains develop. When do they begin recognizing faces? Joining us now with some insight is Dr. Robert Keder, developmental behavioral pediatrician at Connecticut Children's, also an assistant professor of pediatrics at UConn School of Medicine. Dr. Keder, welcome to the show.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for having me.
So generally, when do babies begin to identify faces? I have 2 children, and so it was quite a delight when they were babies, and you could see their faces light up when they were looking at me or my husband.
It is exciting to see babies' faces light up, and that's for good reason too, because that's how they're starting to take in the world. We want to remember that when babies are born, they're kind of nearsighted. So newborn infants can really only see about 8 to 12 inches away from where they are. So that's the perfect distance to be held and cuddled and kind of have that real FaceTime as opposed to digital FaceTime with your parent. But we see that children can start identifying and showing preference for their parents at 3 months of age.
Oh, that's really interesting. And what about the preference of faces of other people in their families?
Well, we see that there's that preference for a mother, for example, over a stranger from research studies at around 3 months. We can see that over the course of a year, that depending on how frequent somebody's around in the family and gets to see the baby or infant will depend on how quickly they get to know them. But we see that around 6 to 9 months, they're definitely able to discriminate and understand who other faces are.
And so when we think about all the different people they may encounter, when you look at babies, when do they start showing preference for things like gender and racial preferences?
We can actually see from some research studies that infants at 3 months old aren't really starting to show gendered or racial preferences, but that starts to change a little bit over time by 4, 5, and 6 months of age. So children will start showing preference for people who look like their mother or whom they have frequent contact with. And this is an area that other researchers are looking into to really seeing if there is more diverse exposure early on, how this might result in an ability to remember faces of different ethnic groups in comparison to those than the one the child identifies from.
Well, that's really interesting. So you were just saying that if babies see many different types of faces, that it will help them later in life with identifying different facial features and different racial groups?
That is a current theory. And we know that babies love looking at faces. So it's kind of an opportunity, but something that we're already doing in pediatrics, where we encourage kids and parents to look at faces and look at picture books of faces as well.
And when we think about just helping babies and children in their development, we live in a multiracial society. Are there suggestions where parents can go to not only promote literacy, but also the wide range of people that they will encounter?
Well, I think the most important thing that any parent can do with their child is really spend that time and engage. Children learn so much, and part of the reason that babies are primed to look at faces, we think, is because it's really where you start. You start to hear sounds from your parents. You start to see mouth movements, eye movements, facial expressions. We start to see what we call a social smile emerge at 2 months old. And that's where if you smile at your baby, they look back at you and smile. And that becomes what we call a serve and return model, where kids learn based off of that back and forth interaction with adults. And that's one of the first steps that we do in terms of helping that building block of language and social skills and facial recognition, amongst other things.
One of my daughter's favorite books when she was a baby was a book of baby faces doing all sorts of different emotions. So what are they seeing when they look at those books that makes them drawn to these types of pictures?
Well, just learning to read those expressions is a real base ability, right, to have that social emotional connection and engagement. We know that babies love looking at faces, and that's why through programs like Reach Out and Read, where we give books to children starting at 6 months old in their pediatric well child visit, that we start with a baby book on faces, and they get to look at that and smile and enjoy and see all those different expressions.
And listeners can go to reachoutandread.org to learn more about those kinds of baby books and to be able to use them in their family. Dr. Keder, before we let you go, what was your reaction to the discovery of these grandmother neurons and the implications as we learn more about how our brains work?
Sure. I mean, I think that this is, for lack of a better term, a really cool study. As someone who started studying developmental psychology in college, a lot of what we've learned is through pattern watching and what we call inductive theory, where people would watch and see, oh, children seem to pick up things in a certain order or sequence. Let's call that milestones. But it's really neat because now we're getting all of the cool scientific technology Dr. Freiwald used in his study to kind of pick out the parts of the brain that are doing these things. And that's still a long way away from clinical applications, but it's really neat to see the science starting to validate some of the patterns that we've noticed early on, and also helping us rethink some of the patterns that we might have gotten wrong in the past.
Well, Dr. Robert Keder, a developmental and behavioral pediatrician at Connecticut Children's, thank you for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
I'm Lucy Nalpathanchil. Today's show produced by Sujata Srinivasan. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. You can learn more about the show. Just download Where We Live on your favorite podcast app.